Good evening and welcome to the 14th Richard Selby Smith Oration, a partnership between the Australian College of Educators and the University of Tasmania, Island of Ideas online public lecture series. Firstly, as a reflection of both institutions' recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we wish to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Julie Rhymes, a Fellow of the College of Educators. I welcome you all to these proceedings. The Richard Selby Smith Oration is an annual event to celebrate the life and work in education of Professor Richard Selby Smith, OBE. The oration is a high-profile public lecture organised by the Tasmanian branch of the Australian College of Educators and supported by the Selby Smith family and the University of Tasmania. Professor Selby Smith made significant contributions to education nationally and in Tasmania over a long period. He was a foundation member of the Australian College of Educators and an active and long-serving member of the Tasmanian branch. He was a fellow of the college. This year, due to the wonders of the webinar, we are able to make the oration a truly national event. This evening, I would like to acknowledge the members of the Selby Smith family who've been able to join us. I would also acknowledge our oration chair, Her Excellency, Professor the Honourable Kate Warner, AC, Governor of Tasmania. Our 14th orator, Professor Lea Waters, AM. Professor Kate Darian Smith, Executive Dean and Pro Vice Chancellor, College of Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania. Professor Victoria Carrington, Dean and Head of School Education at the University of Tasmania. Mr. Ralph Seaborn, Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Professional Resources at ACER. Dr. Sue Thompson, Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Research, ACER. Dr. Jill Abel, Chair of the College in Tasmania. Mr. Warwick Dean, Chair of the College in Victoria. I also acknowledge and thank my Tasmanian colleague, Dr. Duncan Bradley, who has guided this series of lectures over the past 14 years. Just a few housekeeping notes before the evening gets underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function, and raise hand functions have all been disabled, so our speakers are not interrupted. But we do ask you and encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function you'll see on your screens. You can ask questions anonymously, and a selection will be answered during the Q&A session towards the end of the discussion. We'll be conducting a couple of audience polls during the webinar, the first of which is now on your screens. So please feel free to participate if you'd like to. And finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on the university's Island of Ideas YouTube and SoundCloud channels. I'd now like to introduce our oration chair, Her Excellency, Professor the Honourable Kate Warner, AC, Governor of Tasmania, to introduce this year's orator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julie Rhymes, and welcome everyone to the 14th Richard Selby Smith Oration. It really gives me great pleasure to be again able to chair this important event after, of course, it was unable to proceed last year. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce you to this evening's orator, Professor Lea Waters. So Professor Waters is an academic, psychologist, author and speaker who holds a PhD in organisational psychology and is a world expert in school psychology and in parenting. She is the founding director of the Centre for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne, where she's held an academic position for 2.5 decades. Lea holds an affiliate position with the Centre for Positive Organisations at the University of Michigan and is on the science board of the Greater Good Science Centre at the University of California, Berkeley. Lea has published more than 110 scientific articles, and she's been the recipient of major prestigious grants, including a National Health and Medical Research Council grant. She's been awarded academic prizes by the American Academy of Management, the Australian and New Zealand Academy of Management, and the Australian Psychological Society. And she was president of the International Positive Psychology Association from 2017 to 2019, and she currently serves on its executive board. She is the patron for Flourishing Education Japan and the ambassador for the Positive Education Schools Association. So, as well as her published journal articles, Lea's work has featured in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and many other places, The Guardian, Vogue, Elle Magazine, and more. In 2015, Professor Waters was listed as one of Australia's top 100 women of influence by the Financial Review. In 2020, she was named a member of the Order of Australia for her leadership in psychology, education, and the mental health sector in Australia. So I'm sure you will all join me in welcoming Professor Lea Waters to present the 14th Richard Selby Smith Oration. Thank you, Lea.
Well, thank you so much, Her Excellency, and I'm really honestly thrilled to be here, to be the 14th orator of the Selby Smith Oration, and I want to extend my thanks to the Australian College of Educators, the University of Tasmania, and of course the Selby Smith family themselves. It is truly an honour to be able to present to you some ideas that I think are very timely for what we're all going through at the moment, but also not just timely for now, that are important in terms of our students, ourselves, and just the general evolution of the field of education in Australia. And so one of the, audience, I'm driving a Mac here and I haven't driven a Mac before and it's not letting me move down. So I'm just going to get some technical help. I'm so sorry. Okay, here we go. I'm so sorry about that. So what I was about to say to you was one of the advantages, or the opportunities of giving this kind of talk is it gives us the opportunity to pause and step back and ask those sort of bigger questions around education. And so the question that I'm sort of going to frame today's presentation around is, what is the purpose of a school? If you think about schools as, if you step back and kind of look at society as a whole and you look at all of the different institutions that shape our society, what is the purpose of school as an institution in our society? And certainly over the last decade, we've seen a number of major international organisations and local Australian national organisations talking about the broader purpose of a school, so that a school is an institution that not only develops the academic knowledge of our students and the vocational skills of our students, but really coming to the idea of evolving the purpose of schools to also be schools that intentionally and strategically seek to build up the mental health of students, so that students who go to school in Australia graduate with that academic knowledge, they graduate with those vocational skills, but they also graduate with strong mental health. The reason for this is we know that mental health in our teens, in our late teens, has a significant effect on the trajectory of our mental health in our adult life. So you can see all the big players on the screen here, including ACARA, all talking about expanding the notion to the question, what is the purpose of schools? And recognising that one of the key purposes of a school is to also intentionally, strategically, deliberately build up the mental health of Australian students. Now, the reason for this is twofold, this shift in, or this expansion and this uptake of schools across Australia who are now building into their vision and mission statements that one of their key outcomes is to build the mental health of their students. And if you think about why this is becoming so prevalent in Australian schools, we can have a look at two different forces that are leading this change, a push force and a pull force. Let's start first with the push force. And sadly, there are big pushes to schools in more intentionally taking on board the development of mental health of their students and intentionally teaching wellbeing skills. And this is because of the distressing statistics we're seeing around youth mental health in our country. Now, what I'm going to share with you is a couple of slides of the state of mental health, or more aptly, the state of mental distress of young Australians pre-COVID. And then I'm going to move into what the latest statistics are showing us around the mental health fallout of our young Australians living in the middle of a global pandemic. So the slide that you see here is from the Australian Government's Productivity Commission, and this was a report on mental health, an inquiry on mental health that was submitted to the Australian government in June of last year. So these are very recent statistics, but they're still pre-COVID statistics. And what I want to pull out from this report, this is a freely available report, and I urge anyone who's working in schools to go and have a look at this report. But what I want to pull out from this report is one particular figure. And if you have a look at this graph here, it really highlights, if you go and have a look at the age band from kind of mid-teens through our 20s, this is the time, in terms of every pocket of our lifespan, this is the time where we have the greatest vulnerability to experiencing mental illness. And you can see here the overall mental illness is significantly higher at the 15 to 20, getting to like kind of late 20s, and then you see it dip, and you see a similar but slightly more intricate trend in terms of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. So we know, and this is me speaking now as a psychologist, a registered practicing psychologist for the last 27 years, we know that school age, particularly in the teen years, this is the time of the highest prevalence of mental illness for Australians. Now, I'm going to step back to show you some statistics from some other reports leading up to that 2020 report. You see here from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and this is quite an old report now. We're all waiting for the ABS to do another national survey around this, because this report actually comes from 2007. But you can see that report in 2020 from the Productivity Commission at 25, the prevalence of 25%, that was there even back in 2007. We turn to the Telethon report, which was released in 2017, and you see 14%. So that was a study that looked specifically at students, not youth more generally. But again, these are not statistics that we want to see for our young Australians. In 2016, the Origin Youth Report sadly showed us that suicide is the leading cause of death for young Australians, and that just always, it just breaks my heart, you know, that we're an educated, democratic country, we're a wealthy country, we're a well-resourced country, and yet approximately 25% of our young Australians are struggling with mental illness, and suicide is the leading cause of death in the late teens and early 20s. Young men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide, but from the decade of 2005 to 2015, unfortunately, young girls are catching up and suicide rates have doubled. So these are really devastating statistics, and we know that suicide is the leading cause of death within Australia. But when we compare Australia to other countries, and what you're seeing here is from the Global Youth Index, and this was a report done 2 years ago, comparing Australia to 29 other countries. And unfortunately, what you see here is that Australia is significantly higher than the average index across those 29 other countries when it comes to deaths by suicide. And this is not a statistic where we want to be higher than other countries, and we need to be doing something about it. Many of you who are listening may have know that I talk a lot about my own backstory as a teenager struggling from mental illness and losing my own sister to suicide. So I know the pain of that loss, and I want to do everything I can to help schools, help kids to change their trajectory so that we don't end up there. We don't want to be higher than 29 other countries. So we know that youth mental illness is really prevalent in the teen years. But unfortunately, what we're seeing with some of the more recent reports is that younger and younger ages of Australian students are reporting significant mental illness. And this is from the National Telethon report that was released back in 2017, national study. And again, what you see here for the primary school kids is unacceptably high levels of distress and mental illness. And you can see a gender difference, a really strong gender difference here, in that in those younger years, boys are struggling more so than girls. So these are not the kinds of statistics that I would like to stand up and talk about. And I really hope, as a result of what I'm going to talk to you about, and the way schools can more intentionally take a role in building the mental health of their students, in addition to academic knowledge and vocational skills, I really hope that in 10 years' time, I can give a similar kind of talk and we see very different statistics. So what's important to note, though, about the statistics I just presented to you is that they're all pre-COVID. And of course, I don't even need to tell you, but I'm going to show you some statistics. We all know the impact of living through a global pandemic, and what we're seeing that in a daily basis in education on the impact that's having to our students. These results come from the Youth Insight report and also from a UNESCO report that was delivered last year. And these statistics were right at the peak, kind of May, April of last year. So it's important to put a timeline around that, because things are sort of shifting very quickly. But what you see at that peak crisis time is that 60% of Australians, young Australians between the age of 14 to 25, were reporting symptoms of depression, anxiety, and worry. That levels of hope from the ages of 12 to 24 went down by 30% in our young Australians who were not feeling hope at that point in time. And at the very beginning of the global pandemic, around March, 80% of young Australians who were surveyed across the country in this Youth Insight report said, I have the capacity to cope. By May, that figure had jumped down to only 30%. So this is not a pretty picture. You see again that in the older years, 18 to 24, so the university sort of student decades, depression, anxiety, and stress doubled during that time. Now, again, that was at the peak point of crisis for the pandemic, and things have shifted a little bit now, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's not just our students who are struggling. It's obviously also our teachers, and just, as many times as I can, I'm just giving the biggest shout out to every single teacher in Australia, from early learning years right through to the university years. Teachers, you just carried so much last year and are still carrying so much, and you just did such a superb job. And I'm saying that as a person who works with schools, but I'm also saying that as a parent of two teenagers who my kids were well looked after last year. So what we see, though, of course, is that the pandemic didn't just have an impact on the well-being of students, but also on teachers. Teachers reported higher levels of stress, feeling more anxious, and feeling more tired. But what I found really beautiful is that teachers were also saying at exactly the same time that I'm carrying this burden, I'm just extremely motivated. I'm more motivated and I'm feeling more valued. And I think that says something about the profession, that we roll up our sleeves, that we stay optimistic, that we get the work done that we need to get done, even when we're experiencing distress ourselves. It's important for me to put that result in, because even though the focus of today is on student wellbeing, I do really want to recognise the very, very important topic of teacher and support staff wellbeing, and that maybe that's the next topic for the 15th oration, I'm not sure. So look, it's not just the students and the teachers. What I'm showing in front of you now is a large-scale national study that was done by Monash University last year, and this is a nice kind of little loop in here because, of course, Professor Selby Smith was the founding dean of the Faculty of Education at Monash University back in the day. So this Monash University study shows that just generally across our nation last year, anxiety and depression doubled in Australian adults. You can see that clinical levels of anxiety and depression spiked. Again, similar to the previous slide, what I like about these results is that even though we were struggling as a community, as a collective, Australian adults still felt more optimistic than they did pessimistic, by a ratio of 3 to 1. I think that's something that we can harness. Okay, so even all of the results I've just shown you then, it's quick kind of Cook's tour of what's coming out in terms of the mental health impact of COVID. They were all done last year in the peak of the pandemic. Of course, now things are changing. We are all maybe not at that crisis point, but we are all exhausted. You know, psychologists have a name for it now, and it's called COVID fatigue. And this is occurring as a result of living with ongoing adversity and ongoing uncertainty. Things like not being able to think clearly, feeling excessively mentally tired, having brain fog, emotions very close to the surface. So, you know, for me personally, things that normally I could cope with are knocking me off my game a little, like, for example, not being able to press a button to move the screen forward at the start of this talk. So that emotional fragility, having trouble sleeping, and just being physically exhausted. So these are, even if you're not at that kind of clinical level, we know that COVID is continuing to have an impact on us. And for anyone who's listening in Melbourne right now, and I'm here with my ACE colleagues in Melbourne right now, and we've just had the announcement of restrictions starting at 6 p.m. tonight. So I know wherever we are in the country, we're all experiencing the impact of COVID in different ways. So with that said, then we're actually going to go to a poll, and you will have a question on your screen in a minute that's asking you to tell us about the ways in which you have proactively sought to take care of your mental health during the midst of a global pandemic. Okay, wonderful. Thanks to everyone for participating. So we can see here that regular exercise, that kind of physical exercise, has been probably, from what I can see on the screen, the most dominant way in which we've helped to address stress during COVID, and certainly very helpful for us now in the midst of the experience of COVID fatigue, engaging with books and music. Interestingly, mindfulness and meditation comes up as one of the more prevalent ones too, at 7%. Face-to-face catch-ups with family and friends, tuning into our emotions, that's a really significant one for us right now. And many others. I'm seeing if I can drive this, Mac. You can't see my end. You can just see my face and my concentration. So looking for the positives at 7%, tuning into my emotions. And pets, yes, pet therapy is a huge one. My own dog, Pepper, got very upset last year when my two teenage kids, after 2 large rounds of lockdown in Melbourne, went back to school. She was very confused about what was happening there. So great to see can you click that off me? Thank you. Great to see the proactive ways in which we're taking care of our well-being. No, thank you. Okay, great. So that's a nice segue for us to move away from the push factors, the things that, the reason why schools are more and more taking on mental health initiatives, wellbeing type programs, putting it into their strategic agendas, their vision and mission statements, implementing programs and practices, is that push factor, is to get away from those distressing high rates of mental illness. But we also have a pull factor, and that is to move towards mental wellness. And this is where the science of positive psychology has had a really big impact on many schools over the last decade in particular, because what we know from the science of positive psychology is that the pathways that we use to reduce mental distress, depression, anxiety, self-harm, are actually different pathways to the pathways we use to build up mental health: hope, optimism, gratitude, strengths, and so on. So positive psychology has played a really key role in helping schools understand that we need to do both, and that the absence of a negative is not the same as the presence of a positive. The absence of depression is not the same as the presence of hope, vitality, and optimism. There are different pathways that we use to reduce mental illness and promote mental wellness. And so this is where these pull factors come in, where more and more schools in Australia are intentionally adopting the goal of cultivating the mental health of their students, because it's not just about reducing mental illness, it's about promoting mental wellness. And one of the key pull factors for schools is this wellbeing-learning link. And we now have 3 decades worth of research to show us that when we take care of the mental health of our students, they do better academically. It's lovely to have very good science around this, but it kind of speaks to a truism that we know in education, and that is that when a young person is feeling good, they function well. And so lots of research around this topic. I'm just going to present two or three slides for you on this. Again, this could be the whole hour in and of itself. But what you see in front of you is the results of a large meta-analysis that was done with 213 studies looking at the relationship between a student's level of well-being and their academic performance. 213 studies across the globe, a very large student population in this meta-analysis of 270,000 students from kindergarten all the way through until the end of year 12. And the researchers were interested in looking at what happens to the academic grades when schools have put in place an intentional wellbeing program or initiative. Now, what's important to say about this meta-analysis is that the researchers did take into account all of the kind of known factors that we know are predictive of academic grades, things like the type of school, the socioeconomic status of the area, the professional and educational level of the parents. All of these things were included into the statistical analysis. And then the researchers held those things statistically constant and said, okay, above and beyond those things, if a school has an intentional wellbeing approach, program, practice, does that make a significant impact onto the academics of the student? And you can see here in the slide, it does. And it does to the tune of 11%. So what they found with this larger meta-analysis is that when schools intentionally prioritise mental health, you get this lovely byproduct, I call it a byproduct, you get this lovely byproduct of academic achievement. And as I said, to the tune of 11%. So I don't know about you, but as I mentioned, I have 2 high school kids, and if my 2 kids do better academically because their school is helping them to take care of their mental health, that is a win-win, and I will totally take that anytime. So that's a large global study. Let's zoom in now to Australia. This is an old study now, 2011, by Catherine Dix at Flinders University, but it's an Australian study, so I wanted to present this to us. This was a study looking at what happens across 96 schools who had implemented a particular wellbeing program. It was the Kids Matters program, for any of you out there who remember that program. And in particular, the researchers were looking at the quality of implementation. And what they found is that when schools implemented this program, and they implemented it in a high quality way, that students at those schools on average were 6 months ahead in terms of their NAPLAN capabilities that we were requiring of them. So again, very compelling evidence-based to that, the pull factor, why it is that more and more schools are pulling wellbeing in, because it helps them with their academic case as well. One more study around that, and this is a large-scale study published by myself and my postdoc student, Dr. Daniel Lawton, 2 years ago in 2019. This was a large review paper looking at 75 wellbeing interventions. We reviewed 75 wellbeing interventions across 14 different countries with a sample of 35,000 students, again, from kinder right through to year 12. And what you see here is that this review paper was able to show that when schools intentionally bring in a range of different interventions designed to build up the well-being of their students. The students do better academically on a whole host of different metrics. You can see here they do better in their cognitive functioning tests. They do better in grade point average. These were American samples. They do better at their end-of-year grades. That was an Australian sample. Reading proficiency, literacy and numeracy scores, vocabulary tests. So all of these objective indicators of academic performance went up at the end of the wellbeing intervention for students, in contrast to before they had been taught wellbeing skills. So these were objective academic indicators. What we also found in that large-scale review of 75 different interventions with 35,000 students is the students' own self-report in terms of academic outcomes. So we're not talking about objective indicators here now, like grade point average and end-of-year grades. We're talking about the students themselves and their own self-assessments. Students who went through these wellbeing initiatives, interventions at the end reported high levels of academic motivation, more scholastic confidence, feeling more engaged, more satisfied, having a greater sense of belonging at school. We know those three things are critical for academic outcomes, and reported having more successful school transitions from, say, like primary school to year 7, or going through kind of year 9 into year 10, or moving into year 11 and 12. So now we move on to the third part of that paper. And those first two slides were all around the wellbeing-learning link, that when we put in place wellbeing programs, we get these objective and subjective academic outcomes. What's also important to say, thank you, is that the students themselves are saying it's not just about the academic outcomes. And what this large review paper found is that the schools who put in place wellbeing programs also had a lot of mental health benefits for the students. Students reported high levels of life satisfaction, high levels of hope, greater emotional intelligence. Some of these are student reports, some of these are teacher report as well, high levels of resilience. So the first part of that slide is really about the benefit to the student themselves. But importantly, the second part of that slide is the second part of the kind of diamond or the circle, are the pro-social benefits, that the students themselves do better academically, they feel better in themselves, greater resilience, greater hope, greater life satisfaction, but they also become better people. I'm just going to say that as a shorthand. They become more pro-social in their behaviours. They show greater kindness, greater altruism, greater compassion, all things that we're all desperately in need of right now and in the middle of a global pandemic. And the teachers reported that at the end of these kinds of wellbeing initiatives and programs, that there was greater class cooperation and better peer relationships. So again, all things that as educators we want. So all of that research is showing us that when we take care, when we intentionally put in place initiatives, practices, programs, strategies that are designed to build the mental health of our students at school. So going right back to the start with the World Health Organization, the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, OECD, ACARA, etc., all of these major thought leaders in the space telling us that schools are not just about developing academic knowledge and vocational skills, but also about developing the mental health of our students. And the research certainly backs that up. This is a quote from an article of mine published a couple of years ago, talking about the way that I work with wellbeing. And the way that I work with wellbeing as a trained psychologist is, yes, wellbeing is the state of feeling good. But I see wellbeing as something deeper, actually, and I see it as a resource, an internal resource. And when we frame wellbeing as a resource, resources are something that we can build up over time. And what you saw in that last study is that the schools who put in place those wellbeing interventions built up that resource of wellbeing in their students. They built up life satisfaction, hope, resilience, and so on. So if we think about wellbeing as a resource, we can bring it into schools and we can ask ourselves as schools, what can we do? Both in terms of the broader school environment, the broader school culture, in terms of classroom dynamics, and in terms of explicitly teaching wellbeing, so that the court and the taught curriculum, what can we do to build up this resource in our students? So we saw before with your answers, you're doing a range of different things to build up your own resource during COVID. You're doing exercise, you're doing mindfulness, you're spending time in person with family and friends, you're reading books, you're looking for the silver lining, you're tuning into your emotions, you're hugging your pet. whether you know it or not, these are all things that you are doing to build up that resource of well-being. And this is the work that gets me really excited, both as a researcher, but also, directly working with schools, is what can we do to build up that resource for the students, for the adults in the school, and for our school community more generally. And this is where my approach is the visible wellbeing approach. And it's really about saying, okay, if wellbeing is a resource, and if we think of those large international and national organisations saying schools have an opportunity to build up that resource, how do we go about doing it? And as much as we can overcomplicate it, I prefer to work with this really simply and say that there are two key ways we can build up this resource. The first is we have to be able to see the resource. So to make wellbeing visible. Wellbeing is something that is invisible, it's internal, it sits inside a person's subjective internal landscape. What are some practical strategies that we can do to make wellbeing more visible so that we can tune in and see the wellbeing of our students more clearly, more consistently? And once we're able to make that resource visible, once we're able to see the wellbeing of the students, then we have the opportunity to build it up. And if we work with these two very simple steps of just engaging in practices that help us see wellbeing and then build wellbeing, it sets up this very lovely upward spiral, because the better you are at seeing wellbeing, the more chance you have of building it. And then the more you build it, the more you see it. And so we get this beautiful upward spiral. The thing is, though, wellbeing can be a very fuzzy, amorphous topic, because by its very nature, it's subjective and it sits inside a person. And so for the last 8 years, my research has revolved around how do we take something that's kind of a bit fuzzy, invisible, how do we make it more concrete, more tangible, something that we can actually pick up, observe, grab a hold of, and therefore do something with it strategically in a school. So my research over the last 8 years has been focused on how can we develop a really concrete, evidence-based framework that schools can apply to be more systematic and more strategic in the way in which they build up wellbeing. You can see here a range of different research techniques that I've been using over the last 8 years to develop this framework. The framework itself is called the SEARCH framework, and SEARCH is an acronym for the 6 key pathways that the science has shown, starting with that very large data analysis of 1.8 million papers, going right through until sort of case study research with schools, that there are these 6 key pathways that decades of science now show us we can implement into a school to strategically, intentionally, consistently build up the wellbeing of our students. And SEARCH is an acronym. It stands for strengths, which is the first pathway, emotional management, which is the second pathway, attention and awareness. So we saw 7% of people doing mindfulness in the poll. That would fall under the attention and awareness pathway, for example. Relationships, we saw that was one of the big ones too in terms of you taking care of your own well-being. Coping and habits and goals. And so this is the SEARCH framework, the SEARCH acronym. It's a lovely acronym to give to young students because they remember it, they understand these 6 pathways, and they understand that for them to build up the resource of well-being, they have to search for it. They have to put in effort for it, in the same way that if we want to get physically fit, we have to engage in regular exercise and activities. If we want to get emotionally fit, if we want to get mentally fit, we have to engage in regular exercises and activities. We have to put in effort and we have to search for it. So it's an acronym that young kids understand based on a lot of science. If you want to download, all of my papers are free on my website if you're interested in sort of digging into the science a little bit more specifically. Beautifully, though, it's also a larger framework that schools can adopt. As I've said, it's evidence-based. I've been publishing on it for 8 years. Please use it. It's free. It's a way that you can make wellbeing visible and tangible and strategic in your school. So I want to start to bring us towards the end of my talk and just present to you literally a hot off the press study. It got published 2 days ago in the Frontiers Journal of Psychology. And this was a study that I conducted with 2 of my colleagues last year in the peak of the global pandemic, looking at the whether those 6 pathways, which we know have an impact in non-pandemic times, whether those 6 pathways were significantly predictive of student mental health. And so I'll walk you through a little bit of the study. What we did was we asked students, these are all high school students, and this study was conducted in May of last year, so right at that kind of peak time. We asked the students to think about what they had been taught in relation to their mental health prior to COVID. And what you see in those 6 items are the 6 items that map onto each of the 6 pathways of the search framework. So prior to COVID, to what degree did your school teach you how to use your strengths or how to manage and understand your emotions? Then we asked them, when they had returned to school, we were very interested in this concept of what's called stress-related growth. So we couldn't avoid the stress. No one could avoid the stress last year, even this year, but we could make use of the stress to grow as a result of that stress-related growth. And I'll give you some examples of some of the items that are used to measure stress-related growth. So we asked the teenagers, think about whether your experience with COVID-19 has changed you in any of the following ways. And students rated from 1 to 5, 1 being I don't agree and 5 being yes, this is really representative of me. I've learned to deal better with uncertainty. I've learned not to let the small hassles bother me. I found out that I was stronger than I thought. And I've become more accepting of others. That's to give you an example of the type of items that were used to measure stress-related growth. So first part of the study, what we found is a strong and significant relationship. The higher that the students answered in terms of being taught the skill sets around using their strengths and managing their emotions and focusing in on their attention, engaging in mindfulness, connecting with others, the higher their levels of search, the more significantly they grew as a result of going through stress. So then, of course, as psychologists, we're curious about, well, that's great to see there's that link. What's sitting underneath that? So we also asked the students during remote learning, tell us about your coping mechanisms. And in particular, we used surveys that measured 3 coping mechanisms. We measured the students' capacity to process all of their emotions, negative and positive emotions, being able to understand why they were feeling fatigued or frustrated or sad or grief or lonely or angry, whatever it happened to be. And we know that there were ups and downs in the global pandemic, and for some students, actually, remote learning was a better experience for them. So it's important for us to understand the full continuum of emotions and how students were processing. And what we also measured was the students' capacity to positively reframe things. So yes, I'm feeling frustrated and I'm feeling lonely and I'm feeling isolated. But on the flip side, I don't have to put on my school uniform and I don't have to catch the school bus or fight peak hour traffic to get there. So this is a measure that looks at how we understand the negative, but still have the capacity to see the silver linings. And then the third survey that we used in terms of coping mechanisms was students using their own strengths. So maybe you have a student who has a lot of grit and perseverance as a strength. Maybe you have a student who, this is funny, and they're able to see the funny side of all of this, or a student who's got a lot of kindness, who was really reaching out to their friends during remote learning. So we asked the students about their strengths and the degree to which they knew to sort of draw on their strengths during this challenging time. And what we found is that the more that students were taught skill sets around those 6 key pathways around search, the better they were at processing their emotions during remote learning, which then led to a greater likelihood of stress-related growth when they came back onto campus. Likewise with positive framing, and likewise with strength use. Now, the final part of this study, and like I said, the paper has just been released 2 days ago. It's up on my website. You can download it for free. Is that we also asked the students to, when they were back on campus, we asked them to give us a rating of how academically motivated do you feel right now, given everything that's going on. To what degree do you feel focused and motivated to put in effort towards your study? And again, we found significant relationships. So what the study showed us is that search as an overarching wellbeing-oriented framework was a significant predictor of the coping mechanisms that the students used during remote learning, was a significant predictor of the degree to which they grew as a result of stress, remembering those items, I found out I was stronger than I thought I was. I learned not to let the small things bother me as much. I reached out to others. So that's stress-related growth. But it was also a significant predictor of how motivated, as we got back onto campus, how motivated we felt to kind of get on with the business of learning. So that's a kind of quick snapshot of the visible wellbeing approach, and particularly that search framework. Like I said, it's evidence-based, it's well-researched, it's well-published, it's freely available. If any of you are sitting out there right now listening to this and thinking about how can I make wellbeing more visible, more concrete, please consider using the search framework, and let me know if you are. Shoot me an email or contact me on socials, and because I love to hear when schools are using it. Of course, that was a study that looked at what schools had done prior to COVID and the impact of what was done prior to COVID in terms of teaching wellbeing. I've had the great fortune of working with so many schools during COVID and just seeing the beautiful and innovative approaches that schools have used to keep wellbeing at the forefront of the agenda. And certainly that matches on to what the World Health Organization is telling us in terms of the global pandemic, and the World Health Organization has listed student mental health as one of the global priorities during this pandemic, and has also said that schools are a key institution. They're a mechanism, they're an avenue via which we can take care of the mental health of our young students. So that kind of brings me back to the start of the talk, and like, what is the purpose of a school beyond the academics and developing our academic knowledge and our vocational skills, is to also say, and this has been a topic of conversation for over a decade, is to say schools are expanding their mission to also take care of the well-being of the students, and that's become forefront right now in the middle of a global pandemic. So we go back to that big question about what is the purpose of a school, and we come back to where I started, which is the recently published report on mental health by the Productivity Commission. And that report doesn't just look at student wellbeing, it looks at wellbeing all across Australia. But they have certainly come back and made a number of recommendations to the Australian government for schools. You can see here a recommendation of a national student wellbeing guidelines, dedicated funding to go towards strengthening student wellbeing, initial teacher education, having more work within the universities in teaching the skills of wellbeing to our teachers who are about to graduate, with our existing teachers, higher levels of PD around wellbeing, and down the bottom, recommendation that all schools should be measuring. We measure NAPLAN, we measure academics. I love the expression, if you treasure it, you should measure it. So we need to also be measuring the wellbeing of our students so we can see if the resources and the training, the programs and those things that we're putting in are actually having the desired impact that we want. The final conclusion from the Productivity Commission in relation to schools was that our National School Reform Agreement, and you can see the quote here, should place wellbeing on an even footing with academic progress and student engagement. And it should be as an important a goal as the other two, and it should be something that goes across schools, across all sectors, and we all must be working towards this. So in conclusion, I again want to finish where I started, and that is just to say it's truly an honour to be invited to be the 14th orator. And I like to think that if Professor Selby Smith was in the audience, that he would be nodding his head in agreement. We know that he was a pioneer in the field. We know that he was very forward-thinking, and he was always looking for ways to improve education. And I'm here to kind of say today that I think one of the key ways that we can improve education is to listen to UNICEF, UNESCO, World Health Bank, World Health Organization, OECD, ACARA, etc., and really embrace that the purpose of school as an institution is to develop the academic knowledge, the vocational skills, and the mental health of our young Australians, so that we help take them through this global pandemic. And so that, like I said, in 10 years' time, I can stand up and give a talk like this, and we see very, very different statistics. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee, very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. I'd now like to ask Her Excellency if she would chair the question and answer session with our audience.
Yes, thank you so much, Lee. That was an amazing presentation, and I am totally convinced in the value of the programs that you suggest about wellbeing. So we have some questions here. The first one is from Michael. He says, "Fabulous work, Lee. On the assumption that mental health is significantly developed within the home setting, is there any data that show the extent to which school-based interventions can improve the mental health of those students that have less ideal backgrounds?"
Okay, great question, Michael. There is work that's being done on that now, the sort of family home intersection. I've just had one of my PhD students graduate, Dr. Tom Brunzell, at the end of 2019, and he was not specifically looking at that question, but around that question, which was how do we work with students in the classroom who have been affected by trauma? And that's typically repeated relational trauma, so trauma that is coming from the home environment. It's a little bit too early. I don't want to sort of overpromise with the results, but certainly what the results are indicating is that if anything, they're the students who need it the most. And so we cannot change what's happening in their home environment, but we can build up their capacity for resilience whilst they're at school. We can help them learn their own strengths and their own values so that they're able to, again, it doesn't change what's happening at home, but it leads to more of that stress-related growth. It leads them to understand that what's happening to them is not their fault. It leads them to see that they have strengths, that they are good, and it gives them these kinds of techniques. They seem like very small techniques, mindfulness techniques, breathing techniques, real-time resilient thinking techniques. They seem very small things in the face of a difficult, challenging, or even traumatic, abusive home environment. But these small things do make a difference. And again, I don't want to overpromise with the research, but that's certainly what the research is suggesting to us. Speaking from a sample size of one, which is myself, I grew up in a very abusive home and experienced a lot of childhood trauma. And this is back in the 80s. I was very lucky in year 10, year 11, to have a teacher who also taught yoga and meditation. And she used to run a meditation class just once a week at school. Back then we called her the hippie teacher. Nowadays she would be considered as a thought leader, But I went along to those sessions and I didn't tell anyone what was happening at home, but I think she kind of had a sense. So she would always say, "Are you coming along?" And I can tell you just that 1 hour a week of learning how to be still and calm my nervous system down and be connected with myself did make a difference. It did help to buffer what I was experiencing when I left school and went home.
Thank you so much. I actually listened to your YouTube interview and I was so impressed. So I understand obviously the need for you to have engaged with that.
Oh, thank you.
With that teacher at school. So we have one here from Nick. And Nick says the World Economic Forum's 2021 Global Risks Report identifies youth disillusionment as a clear and present danger, driven by pressures such as COVID-19 and climate change. Are you optimistic that we can use wellbeing programs at schools and positive psychology to combat this?
I am. Again, I don't want to overpromise. So I definitely think that the skill set around positive psychology and the science around positive psychology and connecting young people with wellbeing strategies, I think what sits underneath that is helping them to cultivate their own agency, their own voice, their own hope. And so it's more about what they come out of those deeper agency, hope, student voice that I think will help. There was a report that came out last year, the Mission Australia report, which showed and asked teens, Australian teens, what are the 3 top issues for you? This was last year. So no surprise, COVID came out. So did mental health. but the other one was equity. And so young people themselves are telling us that these are things that we want to create change around. And so just adding equity to the list there. These are really complex, what sociologists would call wicked problems. There's not one solution, but I like to think that the more that we create internal strength in our students when they graduate, and this is not just about well-being. A lot of this is also, like I said, there's the pro-social element that comes out, being not just knowing who you are, but being a good person, that if they come out graduating with that internal sense of self, those relational skills, strengths, morals, values, that, you know, this is a contributor towards that generation using their agency to create change that we all need in the world.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Andy Parthenopoulos. He says, should well-being learning through SEARCH be fully integrated with the wider curriculum, or should it be explicitly taught on a standalone basis?
Oh, love that question, Andy. What I particularly like is the word or, because I would get rid of that word. And it's not an either or. It's not let's teach it as a program explicitly or let's build it implicitly into the broader culture of the school. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And with SEARCH, you can use it to develop lesson plans and have that taught curriculum, those explicit wellbeing lessons to the students. You can also use it as an organising framework to shape the culture of your school, so that you have that core curriculum. And certainly what we know is that students learn explicitly through lessons, but they also learn through the cues that they're getting in their environment. And so I think the answer is both.
That does make a lot of sense. We also have a question from Simon Bennett, and he says, based on the evidence that's available, how much does the success of a wellbeing program depend on the effective training of the staff that are called on to deliver the program?
Okay, I really love that question too. So there is quite a lot of research now done from the field of implementation science, and even that earlier study that I mentioned with Catherine Dix from Flinders University. So what are the factors that increase the success of these kinds of programs and approaches? And when we have a look at the implementation science factors, definitely a key one is teaching the adults in the school those wellbeing, the science behind it, the language behind it, and delivering those wellbeing initiatives first to themselves. I've just actually published a paper on this. So how it is that the teachers and the adults, not just the teachers, but all of the adults across the school understand and start to utilize these practices for themselves in the classroom, in their own life. And what the implementation science says is that when that happens, you have greater success in the impact to the student.
So I'm just looking for a question here. Yes. So Helen Spencer asks, can you talk to us about ways schools can map wellbeing other than surveys? Other than surveys, she's saying.
Yeah, sure, Helen, that's a lovely question too, because surveys are really, really useful, but it's difficult to survey younger students. And so there's a range of different ways. This is really now kind of dipping into the science around organisational change. And as I mentioned at the start, my PhD was in organisational psychology. So we learned a lot about that, and I've migrated into schools. Focus groups, interviews, doing audits of the practice that you currently have. One of the techniques that we're using in the visible wellbeing approach with the younger students is circle time, and just sit around two simple questions. What do you think wellbeing is? And what are you doing to take care of your wellbeing? That's a really useful way of collecting data. And we do the circle time, and then we have a teacher annotating. Also, visual data, particularly for the younger kids, so getting them to draw pictures of what they think wellbeing is, where they see wellbeing at school, and analysing the major themes from those pictures. That's always really adorable. I remember at one school we were asking the students, the littlies, the kindergarten kids, what do you think wellbeing is? And one of the kids said, oh, I don't have a wellbeing. I have to ask my mum to get me one from the shops, you know. So like there are a range of different ways in which you can collect the evidence that you need, Helen, above and beyond surveys. So just to summarize, the focus groups, the interviews, the circle time, and the pictorial data with students, with staff, and with parents themselves.
Thanks so much, Lee. That was a great response, and I'm sure Helen will be satisfied with that. But I think our MC, Julie, is that it? Have we got no more time for questions?
I think we could do one more, Your Excellency.
Oh, right. Okay.
Great.
So we've got a question from Bruce Parr here, and he wants to know how well-being is defined with regard to the way a person fits into society.
Okay. Oh my goodness. These are all such great questions. Thanks everyone for being so engaged and really asking those very insightful questions. So what if I had a longer period of time, what I would have done is gone into all those statistics that I showed you at the start. I would have broken them down, because what we know is, I gave you kind of like the newspaper headline. What we know is that students, Indigenous students, Torres Strait Islander students, LGBTQ+ students in minority, students who experience abuse, which is a little bit related to the question before, students in foster system, some students who have learning disorders. These are all factors that intersect with wellbeing in schools, and we need to pay more dedicated attention to those students. We have to understand their context and adapt and adjust what it is that we're doing. For example, mindfulness is really big in schools at the moment. I'm a huge fan of mindfulness myself, going right back to my experience in year 11 at high school in the late 80s. But mindfulness can backfire with kids who've had trauma, and with some kids who have developmental delay, and with some kids with neurodiversity. So we do have to be mindful of not a one size fits all, and they definitely do intersect.
Well, it's time for me to begin to conclude this evening's presentation, but thank you, Your Excellency and Professor Waters, and thank you, the audience, for contributing fabulous questions. Yeah. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Kate Darien-Smith, Executive Dean and Pro Vice Chancellor in the College of Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania, and she's going to deliver a vote of thanks to our orator.
Look, thank you very much, Julie, and I'd just like to thank everyone who's been here in the audience tonight, and particularly to acknowledge Her Excellency the Honourable Professor Kate Warner, AC, Governor of Tasmania, Julie Rhymes, who has been a wonderful MC and speaking on behalf of representing here the Australian College of Educators, the Selby Smith family, and our many distinguished guests in the audience, who I saw from the poll are split between Tasmania and elsewhere, so great reach, just as indeed Professor Waters, you are, and others are in Melbourne. I just really want to deliver a vote of thanks and just make one or two final ending comments. The University of Tasmania recognises its partnership with the Australian College of Educators in presenting this annual Richard Selby Smith Oration, and I really appreciate the efforts of the Australian College of Educators, our team here at the university, in bringing this important and stimulating oration here tonight. And I just want to say I feel very privileged to have listened to you, Lee, as an educator and a parent of young adults. So much of what you said has deepened my own understanding, I think, around the importance of positive psychology and well-being and what that means in our school system. And as someone who is in the university, this is really important for us in two ways. The first is that at the university, we are bringing into our orbit of influence and education young adults. So they're coming straight from school, and we're really dealing at the university with those in a very vulnerable age group, late teens to mid-20s. And of course, wellbeing has been very much at the forefront of what we do and think about throughout the COVID period. I think it's been a really important period of learning about how to take wellbeing in our students and in our staff more seriously and address, bring in strategies to address it. But secondly, of course, what you've raised too is also about how we train our teachers, how we offer ongoing professional development. We have a large and very important school of education that is very much involved in the training of teachers, working with teachers here in the state of Tasmania and elsewhere. And we've recently been refocusing some of our curriculum in teacher training around questions of wellbeing, just as we're refocusing our research around issues to do with generational trauma, resilience, and so on. So there is a kind of I think what you're talking about is just so important, not just within the school system, but more broadly. I feel inspired. It's a sobering topic, but you've left us, I think, feeling a spirit of optimism, possibility of change, and some hope. So a very, very sincere thanks to you from, I think, me on behalf of everyone who's heard this wonderful oration.
And thank you, Professor Darian Smith, and thank you everyone for being part of this 14th Richard Selby Smith Oration. Just a final note of thanks from the college to the Selby Smith family for their ongoing support, our event partner, the University of Tasmania, the Australian Council for Educational Research for hosting the in-person event this evening in Melbourne. So this evening's talk will be available soon as a video and podcast via the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas website, now on your screen. And catching a talk on one of your favourite topics has never been easier at home or in the office, and the series continues with the upcoming talks, also now on your screen. Island life may have changed a little, but the University of Tasmania is looking forward to keeping the ideas flowing. Thank you for being part of this evening, and good evening to you all.